In this video, we will cover the breadth of classical Mediterranean thought, commencing with the earliest literate cultures of the Near East and through the rise of the Greek city-states and eventually the development of the Hellenistic world. At this point, I would like to acknowledge three things. 1. The issue of defining the region. 2. Its overwhelmingly wealthy male representation. And 3. The fragmentary nature of this period of intellectual development. This period of time has often by some authors been described as classical Western thought or pre-Christian thought. These labels would have meant nothing to the people who lived in these areas who were not divided or united by the modern civilizational, ethnic, national, and religious boundaries of the 21st century. In one sense, these labels do point towards two things: the importance of this period to the later cultures who would define themselves as Christian and Western. To be fair to the thinkers of this period are equally important to Eastern Islamic culture, and my inclusion of Persia in this area would stretch any such definition. As this period mainly focuses on the intellectual traditions of thinkers from throughout North Africa, Southern Europe, and West Asia, I have labelled it as Classical Mediterranean period, although the name is less important than recognising the interdependence and blurring between these cultural and intellectual traditions. The second issue I want to discuss is the lack of diversity for many thinkers in this period. There is an obvious lack of female representation in this period. Clearly, women thought, and there were several examples of female political leaders, such as Sobercaneferu from Egypt, and philosophers, such as Hipparchia the Cynic. However, the classical Mediterranean world was, like its Cynic and Indic contemporaries, a largely patriarchal affair. Furthermore, writing, the primary source for the classical era, was primarily the domain of the wealthy, thus generally excluding the rural and poor perspectives. However, what was written in this period went on to be immensely important in the later classical period and in Christian and Islamic cultures that went on to dominate Europe, Africa, and the Near East, and have a large impact throughout the rest of Eurasia. Finally, we must discuss the fragmentation of the intellectual record. For the earliest traditions, there is little that remains written of sometimes millennia-long periods of specific cultures. Even when we have writings, sometimes these are only concerning issues of taxation and governance. Furthermore, even famous authors go through periods of lesser attention, and as such we only have fragmented quotations of contemporaries or later chroniclers from which to reassemble the ideas and writings of these earliest thinkers. Despite all these issues, this video will hopefully give a brief introduction to the rich and varied mixture which stands at the base of much modern Western and Western Islamic culture's thought. Humans had long dwelled throughout the Near East and North Africa, traditionally settling around bodies of water, be those lakes, streams, rivers, or seas. The three most important river systems were the Nile in Egypt and the Euphrates and Tigris in Mesopotamia, literally the land between the two rivers in Greek. A Neolithic revolution in stone technology around 10,000 BCE led to increasing population in these two areas. This coincided a few millennia either way with the development of agriculture, with the farming of wheat, barley, and flax, and the domestication of sheep, cattle, and pigs. From this technological and agricultural revolution, the two earliest centres of civilization in the Mediterranean emerged around these two major river systems. The city-states of Mesopotamia are among the oldest urban and literate cultures in the world. The Sumerian and Akkadian peoples dominated Mesopotamia from the beginning of its written history, around 3100 BCE, with the area slowly coalescing around a series of empires, including the Babylonian and Assyrian empires and their many successors and usurpers. The intellectual influence of these empires is hard to understate, with a major impact on the Hittites in now modern Turkey, the ancient Greek Mycenaean peoples to the northwest, the Phoenicians to the west in modern Lebanon, and the Persian cultures in what emerged in the east. The relationship between ancient Mesopotamian cultures and their native environment was harsh. The Euphrates and Tigris were unpredictable, difficult to navigate, and prone to flooding, which overturns the best laid intentions and constructions of farmers and kings alike. This is reflected in the tragic and somewhat fatalistic conceptions of human roles in the cosmos found in Mesopotamian literature, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. To the Mesopotamians, the gods were immanent, present, and capricious. However, The Babylonians in particular made significant contributions in the areas of mathematics and astronomy. They also used these practical sciences in the practice of religion and, of particular interest, divination. The Mesopotamians thought of the world as being full of signs, which signified the future and which could be unlocked and controlled through practiced study. Both the science which undergirded Mesopotamian divination and the fortune telling itself remained important throughout Mediterranean history. The other great civilization which came to prominence in this period was the Egyptian Empire. Insulated from invasion by deserts and provided a steady supply of water and silt by the regular and much more placid Nile, the Egyptians developed a more unified, stable, and conservative state than their Mesopotamian contemporaries. When I say conservative, I mean that Egyptian culture was very resilient, maintaining forms and practices throughout the centuries, and remaining surprisingly resilient to outside ideas, something expressed as a blatant chauvinism and xenophobia. However, Egypt was truly a center of higher culture in its own right, developing advanced mathematics, medicine, and architectural practices, which would not be surpassed for millennia. In particular, Egyptian mathematics was widely recognized in the later classical Greek world as of superior quality, that is, until the Greeks surpassed it themselves. Egyptian religious belief was much more optimistic than their Mesopotamian contemporaries. Their interaction with the world was seen as less confrontational and instead saw the divine as a benevolent force which protected humanity, often through the figure of the semi divine pharaohs. Similarly, Egyptian ethical practice was based around the concept of Ma'at, a universal ethical and moral principle that all members of the kingdom were expected to follow throughout their lives. This ideal of justice and truth reflected the broader cosmic balance and harmony that bound the universe together. By acting in accordance with Ma'at, the individual participated in the wider order generated from Ma'at, which included the regular seasons and bountiful crops of the Nile River Valley. One anomaly that existed in this otherwise relatively continuous culture was the rise of Akhenaten, also known as the heretic pharaoh, who instituted a form of quasi-monotheism, worshipping the sun disk god Aten. It has been speculated by some authors as a precursor and definitive influence on later Abrahamic monotheistic religions, although this is a long bow to draw with regards to the unique developmental considerations and internal dynamism of the three Abrahamic faiths, and the much more direct influence of other traditions such as Zoroastrianism and Neoplatonism. The world of Egypt and Mesopotamia would be shaken around 1200 to 1150 BCE in a period called the Late Bronze Age collapse. During this period, there was a collapse of numerous kingdoms and states, with the exception of Assyria and Egypt, which were greatly weakened. This is also called the Greek Dark Ages, as the Mycenaean Greek civilization lost literacy in a form of cuneiform texts with the collapse of the Greek city-states, coinciding with broader reductions in literacy and trade throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. Virtually every city between Pylos and Gaza was destroyed or abandoned in this period. The cause of this collapse has been posited as climate change, the introduction of iron weapons, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and even the invasion of an ill-defined group called the Sea Peoples. However, no scholarly consensus exists on this issue. What did happen is that this collapse opened the door to the emerging Iranian peoples in Persia and rejuvenated the cultures of the Near East. The Iranian peoples, of whom the Persians and the Medes would be the most important of this period, originally came from the same Indo-European migration which brought the Aryans to North India. Initially, they shared similar language, religion, and traditions with their Vedic contemporaries. However, with time, they developed their own distinct cultural flavour. The semi-legendary sage figure, Zarathustra, also called Zoroaster, established a religious movement which supplanted the earlier polytheism and instead posited a dualistic worldview in which the forces of light, under the divinity of Ahura Mazda, battled the forces of dark under the demonic Angra Mainyu. This religion was the formative influence of apocalyptic beliefs and traditions in later Abrahamic religions, including the belief in an eventual end times and battle between the forces of good and evil. Unique in the dualistic religion of Zoroastrianism was that worshippers were seen as having a clear choice between good and evil, and that the outcome of this battle was far from clear. The Persians and Medes came to importance as they assisted the Neo-Babylonian Empire in overthrowing the last of the Assyrian empires. The Persians eventually conquered their Median cousins and then went on to create an empire stretching from North India to the Mediterranean coast, and would remain a major cultural power, although at times suppressed under Greco-Macedonian conquest, until the final Zoroastrian Empire was absorbed during the period of the Islamic conquests. However, Persian language, science, and philosophy would remain an important influence in the Islamic world following that conquest. Another culture which would emerge following the late Bronze Age collapse, and which would be of particular importance in the development of Mediterranean, Christian, and Islamic societies, was Judaism. Emerging initially out of the Canaanite polytheistic culture of the Levant, the early Israelites split ways with their Canaanite fellow travellers in the establishment of a henotheistic religion, sometimes called Yahwehism, in which Yahweh was seen as the one God for the Israelites, but did not deny the existence of other gods. The conquest of the Israelite kingdoms of Israel and Judah by the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonian Empire then brought about a second period of development in Judaism, monotheism, in which Yahwehism evolved into a more puritanical rejection of all gods besides Yahweh. With the eventual repatriation of the Jewish exiles following the conquest of the Babylonians by Persia, one can describe the monotheistic religion as truly having been established, as opposed to the less popular and influential Aten worship of Akhenaten. However, the development of monotheism posited new philosophical and theological issues, such as the problem of evil. This is explored most fully in the Book of Job, where Jewish faith directly examines the issues of an all-powerful and benevolent God in an imperfect and often capricious world. In some ways, we can see this as directly combating the dim and tragic worldview of the contemporary and antagonistic worship of Near Eastern polytheism. The same collapse which led to the Persian and Jewish Renaissance in West Asia remoulded the Greek world. The Mycenaean Greeks, who had been tightly bound into the Mesopotamian cultural sphere, using cuneiform writing and involved in the cultural and economic sphere of their Egyptian and Mesopotamian neighbours, entered a dark age with the loss of writing and the destruction or abandonment of almost all major urban centres throughout Greece. However, culturally, this proved to be a formative creative period, with such epics as the Iliad and the Odyssey composed, probably by a series of oral storytellers who eventually came to be attributed to a semi-mythical poet figure, Homer. Greek religion was founded on these epic works, and like Mesopotamian religion, had a pessimistic and fatalistic view on what they saw as a fundamentally tragic nature of human conditions. However, another development in the Greco-Roman religion was the proliferation of mystery cults, who initiated worshippers into rites which promised salvation and eternal life. Historically, these cults have been purported as an outsized impact on Christianity, with similar ideas of universal salvation, purification, and redemption, although many such traditions can similarly be found in the Jewish tradition. Perhaps a more solid line can be drawn between the mutual influence between such cults and Neo-Pythagorean and Neoplatonist movements, which did have a much better documented impact on the early church theology. It is at this historical juncture that Greek and Phoenician cultures commenced a period of expansion through colonization, establishing numerous cities throughout the Mediterranean world. The most important Phoenician outpost would be Carthage, which would be the most powerful independent North African power until its conquest by the Romans. The Greeks, on the other hand, established important settlements in Sicily, North Africa, and into the Black Sea. However, the most important divide was between those Greeks who lived on the west coast of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and those who lived at the tip of the Balkan Peninsula in modern-day Greece. Those who lived in the east were under the control of the Persian satraps, while those in the west primarily lived in independent city-states and leagues. The first thinkers who would come to be called philosophers emerged in the eastern half of the Greek world, in the confluence of the many cultural, religious, and intellectual traditions of West Asia. This group of thinkers, often called the Ionians, from the Greek name given to the region, were primarily focused on cosmological explanations for the world. This included theories about the fundamental material of the universe and explanations for how the universe came about, although early thinkers such as Thales of Miletus similarly made advances in mathematics and astrology by drawing on Egyptian and Babylonian teachings. A rival school of thinkers was established in the far western Greek world in Italy around the thinker Pythagoras. However, this tradition blended religion, mysticism, mathematics, and philosophy in a way which seems somewhat similar to the mystery cults. The tradition highlighted ideas that were popular in India, such as reincarnation, as well as pushed mathematics as pure and metaphysical truth beyond the banal reality of sensory experience. These ideas would prove immensely important in later Platonic traditions, and Neo-Pythagoreanism would see a re-emergence in late antiquity. However, at the time, the Pythagoreans attracted ill will due to their odd and secretive ways, which eventually overflowed into violence as Pythagorean communities were destroyed by angry locals. The final of these earliest groups of philosophical thought was the Eleatic School, which was also developed in the Western Greek world. The Eleatics similarly rejected the everyday sensory perception of the movement, existence, and separation. Instead, under a key founder of the movement called Parmenides, they advanced the idea of the universe as a single monistic whole. They then defended this by using paradoxes to show that the arguments of earlier philosophers about movement led to inevitable contradictions. The most famous of these paradoxes was recorded by Zeno. This monism, although less influential with the passing of time, remained a live philosophical position which was countered by both the Sophists and the Platonists. In the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire attempted to extend its reach beyond Asia and into Europe. This was particularly in response to Western Greek cities, primarily the Athenians, giving support to Eastern Greek cities which had rebelled against the Persian Empire. Under the king Darius, a relatively small Persian army attacked Athens, but was shockingly defeated at the Battle of Marathon. A generation later, when the Persians returned, this time with a much larger army under King Xerxes, they campaigned, burned the cities of the north, and, facing defeats at land and sea, eventually withdrew, leaving a small force behind who was soon routed by the Greeks, who had unified in an alliance against the Persian invaders. The war was then immortalized in the book by Herodotus, the so-called father of history, who was, as a later time of intra-Greek strife, harkening back to a period of unity. Although this was a relatively small issue for the Persians, a minor setback in a war against a relatively unimportant people on the fringe of empire, this war was key to establishing in the Greek psyche the relative importance with regards to the rest of the world, and the strength of their arms. From this point onwards, the Greek culture and ways of war would come to have an increasing impact on Eastern Mediterranean, and has been looked back to by many scholars as the heart of the so-called East-West divide. Following the end of the Persian Wars, there was an outburst of creative activity, especially in arts such as drama and comedy. Similarly, there was an outburst of intellectual creativity. One of the schools which emerged was the pluralists. Developed as an attempt to merge the monistic ideas of the Eleatic monist school and the changing world of sense experience, this led to many creative and influential cosmological solutions that often combined aspects of Ionian and Eleatic ideas. At the same period, another school of great influence emerged in the form of the atheistic Atomists. The most famous of this school was Democritus, and they got around the problems of Zeno's paradoxes by asserting that all existed was atoms, the smallest indivisible unit of matter, and void. For the atomists, all sensory experience and macroscopic objects were merely forms of convention. The whirling of atoms and void was all that really existed. While these schools bickered, a new tradition of wandering teachers who accepted payment for their services emerged, the Sophists, loosely translated as wise men. The name comes from the same root as philosopher, which means lover of wisdom. These teachers often hired themselves out to wealthy families to teach the arts of rhetoric and debate, making them popular in Athens, where the legal system was part of everyday life. However, they have also earned an evil reputation as relativists and nihilists, largely because they stood in opposition to one of the more influential schools of classical Mediterranean thought, Platonism, which we'll discuss shortly. However, what is clear from the few fragments that we have of the Sophists is that they were much more concerned with the how of living life rather than the abstract cosmological message and musings of the earlier philosophers. Eventually, the Greek city-states coalesced between two leading cities from the Persian Wars: Sparta, an oligarchic militaristic state, and Athens, a democratic but imperialist city. Mutual distrust between these states led to a series of conflicts which collectively were called the Peloponnesian War, ending with the defeat of Athens and the short-lived victory of Sparta. The true winners of the conflict were the Persians and the Macedonians, a related people north of the Greeks under their own kings. The Peloponnesian Wars were recorded in the masterful work of Thucydides, who used the war as a study not only of the particular conflict, but also prying open the workings of statecraft and human nature. The hubris of the Athenians is a common subject of the book, along with Thucydides' unstated but apparent belief in the corrosive effect of democracy on regime and strategy. In all, the most important insight is that the three factors which drive societies to war are fear, greed, and honour. One Athenian who served during the Peloponnesian War became a local celebrity in Athens, employing many of the same tactics as the Sophists. He taught young men and engaged in dialogue. However, he rejected all forms of payment, and his name was Socrates. He constantly asked, prodded, and examined the Athenian people, calling himself a gadfly who bit the populace and forced them to examine themselves in their positions. Obviously, this earned him no friends. However, his association with sophistry, which was unliked by many Athenians, and some of his associates, got him into hot water. Some of his fellow travellers and students led a vicious and bloody oligarchic regime following the fall of Athens to Sparta, and Socrates was tarred with the same brush. Eventually, he was charged with corrupting the youth and was sentenced to death. Although he could have fled into exile, Socrates remained in Athens and drank hemlock under order from the state. His many followers then spread out throughout Greece and drew upon Socrates' legacy in founding their own schools of thought. Socrates was so influential that many historians of Greek philosophy describe it as being cut into a pre- and post-Socratic phase. One of Socrates' students was called Aristippus from Cyrene in northern Libya. He returned to his home city following Socrates' death and founded a hedonistic school which came to be called the Cyrenaics or Cyrenism after the city. This school pursued pleasure as the only true aim of life. Over time, the school appeared to deviate with regards to what true pleasure was and whether a good life could be thought of as pleasurable. But eventually, this thought and tradition would peter out in favour of the more sophisticated Epicurean school. Another school was founded in the Greek city of Megara by a Socratic student called Euclid. The school combined Socratic ideas of a singular good with Eleatic doctrines of monistic unity. Later, the school developed logical ideas concerning modality and propositions, and was called by some historians the dialectical school on the basis of their logical teachings. More important than the previous two schools which petered out was one of the more important students of Socrates, Antisthenes, who drew upon the most radical and critical aspects of Socrates' teaching to form the Cynic school. The Cynics focused on true virtue and disregarded convention, including family, society, and the polis, doing socially outrageous actions, such as defecating and masturbating in public to shock people out of their commonplace understandings. The Cynics remained a small but important tradition throughout the classical world, and were the womb from which the more influential Stoic tradition was eventually born. Although these other schools were interesting or important in their day, the most important philosophical tradition and philosopher from this age was Plato. From a wealthy family, Plato wrote a series of dialogues which used Socrates as their main protagonist. Throughout the dialogue, Plato explores issues concerning virtue and ethics and uses large amounts of humour, irony, and high literary style which has been lauded throughout the ages. Plato's most important work is The Republic, in which he explores several ideas which are key to his system of thought. These include the theory of forms, which is basically his position that if there is a plurality of things in existence in the sensible world, there must be a perfect and primal form of these plural things in a realm above and beyond the sensible. For instance, there are many horses, but Plato thought they all derived from one singular form of the horse. The aim of Platonic philosophy was the pursuit of understanding these forms, including abstract ideas such as beauty, courage, and goodness, and then the application of this knowledge in running society. Plato, perhaps because of the democratic execution of his friend and mentor Socrates, thought this was best achieved through a singular philosopher king, someone who would implement the best society in line with true knowledge and judgment based on philosophy and an understanding of the forms. In line with this intention, Plato travelled to Sicily and attempted to turn the tyrant of the city of Syracuse, called Dionysus, into such a philosopher king, although he apparently failed. This aspect of his philosophy has led to the charge by many that he represented the authoritarian and despotic faction in politics. Plato went on to establish a school of philosophy called the Academy. Here he lectured and taught on numerous topics, including several of his untaught doctrines, which were so called because they were not passed down to us in his dialogues, but survive in the teachings and fragments of his followers. These were primarily metaphysical speculations about the formation of the universe, including the one, reminiscent of the Eleatics, and the dyad, throwing back to the pluralists. This also included mathematics and geometry, of which the so-called early or old academy made several contributions. It was said that written over the entry into the academy was a sign saying, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." The most important thinker who did enter the academy was a philosopher by the name of Aristotle. Not from Athens, he had taken up the subject as a young man in northern Greece. For some time he studied with Plato, and after his teacher's death he travelled throughout Greece, teaching and collecting samples before finally establishing his own school called the Peripatetic, with its own institution in Athens called the Lyceum. Aristotle discoursed on a huge number of subjects, and the majority of what has come down to us is in the form of notes written concerning his lectures. In logic, Aristotle practically invented the subject of formal logic, painstakingly assembling the base of what would come to be classical logic in the Western tradition. With the tools of logic, he then turned to metaphysics and did away with the theory of forms of his Plato. Instead, Aristotle argued that being, or substance, was a compound of matter and form, and that this form was immanent rather than transcendent, meaning that there was no greater universal form from which a substance gained its particular form. Instead, rather crudely, Aristotle was arguing that any universal form was actually less real than any particular form, and in this case, the form of a horse is merely the combination of all horses. Aristotle showed an immense interest in natural philosophy as a precursor to science, and collected huge amounts of natural observations. He wrote extensively on physics, meteorology, astronomy, geology, and perhaps most influentially, on biology. He made large strides in defining the broad parameters of these fields and the philosophy behind how a science should be built up. But his influence was so great that for centuries, many of the obvious and flawed issues in his writings actually stymied the development of Western sciences until advances in physics, astronomy, and biology in the Islamic Golden Age and the European Renaissance overthrew Aristotle's received wisdom. Aristotle also spent some time in the court of the Macedonians and taught the young Alexander the Great, although their relationship is a point of scholarly and popular debate. As time passed and he returned to Athens, he found himself on the wrong end of anti-Macedonian sentiment following the death of Alexander the Great. Declaring that he would not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy, a reference to Socrates' execution, he then fled the city before dying in his mother's estate in southern Greece. Emerging around the same period was a thinker by the name of Isocrates, who was one of the leading minds in the arts of rhetoric. He developed the discipline, but also used it to attack the Sophists, who had been the traditional teachers of rhetoric. He forwarded a form of pan-Hellenic nationalism, drawing on the brief unity experienced during the Persian Wars, and cried out for a unifying figure to bring the Greeks together under a single banner. Late in his life, he set his sights on the Macedonians, who he thought could unify the Greek city-states, which had recently been defeated by Alexander's father, Philip the Great. However, the death of Philip and the campaigns of Alexander brought about not a Greek nation, but the birth of the Hellenic world. Philip the Great, father of Alexander, had transformed Macedonia from a backwater kingdom and sometimes Persian puppet to a strong regional military power, with a professional army under the central command of the royal family. Philip then defeated the Greek city-states and nominally brought them under his control as a league of equals. However, his death under mysterious circumstances catapulted his son Alexander to the throne, who would then change the world. Alexander quickly crushed a resurgent rebellion amongst the Greek city-states, and then gathered a large army and attacked Persia. Against all expectations, he defeated the Persian army, stripped the king of his western possessions, including Syria and Egypt, before marching all the way east to North India. In his wake, he brought the Greek language, culture, and thought which blended with local custom. Following a mutiny, Alexander returned to Babylon where he died from a mixture of hard drinking and illness. With no clear heir, his massive empire fragmented into a series of kingdoms controlled by his former generals. In the brutal war which followed, three major Hellenic, or Greek-like kingdoms emerged: Ptolemaic Egypt, Antigonid Macedon, and Seleucid Persia. These Hellenic kingdoms would usher in a new age of the Mediterranean world, one in which Greek culture penetrated far beyond its original homeland, with Greek becoming the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. However, it also saw intellectual dynamism as Greek, Mesopotamian, Persian, and Egyptian cultures became closely entwined and ideas seeped in from the Far East in India. One of the most important aspects of the intellectual culture in the Hellenic world was the development and systematization of mathematics and geometry, most notably in the form of the mathematician Euclid. Although inventing little that was new, he clearly systematized geometry in a way that would hold sway until the 19th century, and until this time, his book was still widely used as a definitive textbook in the matter of geometry. Other Greek thinkers, such as Archimedes, were more interested in the aspects of natural philosophy which would become known as physics, and he put his knowledge into practical application through the development of war machines which, for a time, held back the might of the ascendant Roman Republic. However, science and maths were not the only areas of intellectual growth. One thinker, Pyrrho, who accompanied Alexander east to India, is thought to have brought back influences from potentially Jain, Buddhist, Brahmin, or Charvaka sages, and established a skeptical tradition called Pyrrhonism in Greece. Facing unknowable reality, the Pyrrhonists suggested that we should instead withhold judgment. This skeptical tradition remained a small but influential tradition throughout the early Roman Empire. Another school, established by the thinker Epicurus and called Epicureanism, drew upon the teachings of the Atomists and the Cyrenaics to develop an atheistic, materialist, and physicalist tradition which would become very influential in both the Greek and Roman world. Although rejected by philosophical rivals as crude hedonism, Epicurus advocated a life of modest pleasures and communal living. Perhaps the most influential of the Hellenistic schools were the Stoics, who accepted a pantheistic and determinist universe based upon an all-benevolent and rational Zeus, of whom we are all a part. Developing a complicated system of metaphysics and logic, the Stoics are best remembered for their tough-love system of ethics, which advocated for the pursuit of an unattached and dispassionate disposition, focusing on aligning our choices to the good, but not being concerned with the outcome of these choices as they lay beyond our control. The Stoics were immensely influential in the early Roman Empire, winning adherents amongst the senatorial and, in one case, imperial class. Platonism did not stand still in the face of these new challenges and continued to develop with a phase called the New or Late Academy. This tradition borrowed heavily from Pyrrhonism and developed a second skeptical tradition in the Greco-Roman world. Some scholars argue that initially there was little difference between these two traditions. However, with time, the focus of the new academy fell to describe a more livable version of skepticism in the face of Stoic and Epicurean attacks. Eventually, Platonism would attempt to reconcile Stoic and the new academy thought into a new phase, called Middle Platonism. However, that lies beyond the scope of this video. The Hellenic world was dynamic, wealthy, and intellectually expansive. However, clouds were gathering to the west. In a series of brutal wars, the rich and powerful empire of Carthage was brought low by a city-state which had subjugated its Latin-speaking neighbours, Rome. Hellenic invaders, including Pyrrhus of Epirus, who is of Pyrrhic victory fame, were brought low by the Roman armies, and with the destruction of Carthage by the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Romans had become the undisputed masters of the Western Mediterranean. Slowly, they turned their attention to the east, and, With the shift of the locus of political power to Rome, so moved the most intellectually vibrant traditions of the day. This closes the classical period of the Mediterranean world. At this stage, the intellectual waters can be seen as four raging rivers: Platonism, Aristotelianism, also known as the Pathetic School, Stoicism, and Epicureanism, which is watered by another three minor tributaries: Cynicism, Pyrrhonism, and the rhetorical teachers following in the tradition of Socrates and the Sophists. It was from this rich and varied culture that new ideas and traditions would emerge in the Roman Empire as the Roman state consolidated control over the entire Mediterranean, calling it Mare Nostrum, or our sea.